So I wanted to talk just a little bit about turning forms and I guess how it came to be where it is with us currently on its sort of slight detour from the state that we saw it in at the beginning when it came to Tess Studio, and of course it will eventually, actually not too long a time, in November, return to Marlborough Academy where it belongs. So for this brief window, we have it at the Hepworth Wakefield reunited with, as you can see in the background here, contrapuntal forms, the other sculpture that Hepworth made for the Festival of Britain. And both of these were sort of shown very close together in 1951, albeit in a completely different and much more urban landscape, as I mentioned before. So I wanted to sort of give a bit of a sense of the context here. So we have this beautiful garden now. However, it was not always the case. When the Hepworth Wakefield was built in 2011, it had outside of it this big patch of green, and it was basically kind of unloved apart from, and unused apart from a sort of patch of worn grass as people walked across it in a sort of Richard Long homage. So we tried to use it where possible for artistic projects, and you can see a couple of those here, Heather and Ivan Morrison, The Black Cloud, which was here at 2013, and Palanquin, which we showed when we looked at Caro and architecture in 2015 inside the galleries. So there was always this ambition to connect the outside with the inside, and this sort of took fruit when we started to make plans and fundraise to develop this green patch into a proper garden. And it was designed by Tom Stewart Smith after a competition. And then the sort of fundraising began in earnest, and eventually it opened in 2019. We had a sort of soft launch, although it came into full bloom in spring 2020. And as our chair pointed out yesterday, it was absolutely the right moment for a beautiful public garden to be made available to the local residents, as these spaces became so important during lockdown. As you can sort of see on this picture, the idea of sculpture in the garden was something that was very important for us from the outset. And so this is one of the original designs which show Hepworth's ascending form, which is in our collection, perched there on the edge. And here's the garden as it was launched, with contemporary sculptures like the Michael Craig Martin, you can see there alongside Hepworth's. So then we come to 2021 and the exhibition that's on at the moment. So when we were planning the big Hepworth retrospective, of course, the obvious question was, well, what will we put in the garden? And initially I had thought that perhaps we could use the plinths in the garden to expand upon this idea that I wanted to open the show with, which was to explore the three forms that Hepworth said, and she wrote this actually around the same time that she was making this work, that she said had obsessed her throughout her life, and that was the single form, the two forms, and the enclosed form or oval pierced form, and how these sort of related to the experience of being in the landscape, our experiences of being in relation to each other, and this feeling of being embraced by nature, respectively. And of course, we already had our sort of single form in the garden with ascending form here. So initially I was looking for two sculptures that would exemplify the two forms and the pierced form, respectively. And then it was suggested to me that I might consider the vast task of bringing together the Festival of Britain sculptures, because it would be 70 years since they were last seen together on the South Bank. Now, as both of these are listed objects, it was quite a long logistical task to get the permissions to move them. Although, because Turning Forms had already been agreed for this vast restoration project that Tessa, I think, was already embarking upon, they were also willing to sort of bring it to a new audience before it returns there. And of course, then it led me to think about where these two works sat within the retrospective, because the show itself charts Hepworth's very long career from her beginnings in Yorkshire all the way through to works made shortly before her death. And of course, these come sort of somewhat in the middle. So in the exhibition, you've seen her journey towards from figurative works to abstract carvings and figurative drawings to abstract drawings, such as this turning form from 1946, very much connecting back to the constructivist work that Nick was mentioning there, although at this time she's very much not wanting to be called a constructivist. But nonetheless, there are those associations. And then we move into these figurative works that she starts making from 1947-48, and the hospital drawings. So it's quite an interesting time in her practice, actually, leading up to this moment where she has been sort of very strictly abstract and then more figurative. And she says at this point in 1948, this interesting quote that sort of connects, I think, these two sides of her work. So I've put it here. Working realistically replenishes one's love for life, humanity, and the earth. Working abstractly seems to release one's personality and sharpen the perceptions. I don't feel any difference of intention or of mood when I paint or carve. Realistically, when I make abstract carvings, the two ways of working flow into each without effort. It all feels the same happiness and pain, the same joy in a line, a form, a colour, the same feeling of being lost in pursuit of something. This is writing to Herbert Reed in 48. So I've thought about this quote a lot. She was writing it about her kind of paintings, really, I think, particularly her incredible output of figurative paintings at this time and how they connected perhaps to her reputation as an abstract carver. But it's really interesting to think about it in relation to these two works. She then started making in the same year, in 1950, and the one, Contrapuntal Forms, these two figures in carving, and then the other, Turning Forms, this sort of abstract carving, although I'm very struck by Nick's description of these as two figures. And of course, there are those sort of figurative elements, as Sophie mentioned, the spine that comes through. Although nonetheless, I think it's very clear that they fall in these two camps of the figurative and the abstract. In the exhibition, we then move on to this section that looks at Hepworth's return to working in metal and how that allowed her to express forms that she said could not be contained in the block of wood or stone, these more fluid forms that relate to movement. So this first happens in 1951, just around the time that she's making these works. She's also working with Marcus and Denis on the play. I was trying to think of the theatrical production of Electra at the Old Vic. And in addition to designing the sets, she designs this sculpture in metal rod to play the part, if you will, of Apollo, the god. And it's interesting because not only do you have this very fluid form, but as it's lit from different directions, you get also this kind of ephemeral figure appearing on the walls behind in silhouette. And so the god can be sort of moving, if you will. What kind of struck me was how when we were making the show, you move on from that section into the first works that she makes in bronze in 1956. But having learned more about Hess's process, or the process of making turning forms, what struck me was that there's a great similarity in the kind of makeup of turning form and these later works in metal. So here you can see the expanded aluminium mesh and rods that made the sort of skeleton for the bronze works. And here I'm looking at a work called Pavan, which takes its name also from a dance. So this idea of metal work being connected to movement and how that sort of relates to turning forms as well, with its metal skeleton. And then, so to make these works, she would put plaster onto the armatures and work the plaster, create this surface, and then have them cast in bronze. This is the prototype for the bronze cast. We also have in the collection a metallized plaster version, which of course bears a sort of striking resemblance again to turning forms in its whiteness. Metallized plaster was this sort of coating of molten zinc that I don't think Hepworth may not have considered very successful, as it doesn't seem to have been repeated. But nonetheless, you get this sense of this process allowing her to create this sense of movement, just as turning forms has, even if it's not actually able to move anymore. And I wonder if she also saw this connection between these works and turning forms, because as you see at this time in 1956 and 57, she started painting in a very different style. And I put this illustration up so you can see some of those much more gestural, dynamic paintings in the background that have these kind of looping forms and lines like you see in the sculptures. And of course, as Nick noted, she also made in the same sort of medium, in the same sort of style, a turning form that so clearly relates back. So I think there's an interesting connection between this work that seems kind of almost out of place in 1950-51 and Hepworth's work, and then her move into bronze casting in 1956. And I'll leave it there.